Hey, if you've been reading the Bible and thinking, why does this feel so violent? You're not imagining it. There are wars, there are judgments, there are severe consequences sometimes to the way people act. And for modern readers, that can feel pretty unsettling, I think, especially Westerners. So I don't want to dodge that. I want to help you understand what you're actually seeing, what you're actually reading. Hey, welcome back to Side Questions, where we tackle the questions that often come up while reading the Bible. I think you can see that today I'm coming to you from the old mobile office, kind of a different situation. Please be sure to hit that like button, subscribe button, and post your comments and questions below. So back to the question of violence. Why is the Bible so violent? Is it violent? Are we imagining it? Well, no, we're not. Description, we need to understand, description is not endorsement. We need to be able to tell the difference. So the Bible records violence. It doesn't always endorse it. Narrative, recording what happened, is not command. When Scripture tells us what happened, that does not automatically mean that it is prescribing or endorsing what happened or that thing should happen. And this distinction, I think, helps remove probably a lot of the confusion. So let's check and see what's going on here. So we need to understand, one, the world of the Bible, in particular the Old Testament, but really the New Testament too, wasn't that much different, was already incredibly violent. The Bible didn't create a violent world. It simply speaks into a violent world. And we need to remember that. Empires conquered. These are things that we're not used to today. Of course, there's war and there's violence in the world today, but it's nowhere near as widespread as it used to be, historically speaking. So empires conquer. This was very common. It would have been very unusual for a person to live very long without experiencing war or devastation in some form. So empires conquered, kings crushed their enemies, nations enslaved other nations. And in that setting, we kind of get surprised maybe when all that violence happens because we're not used to it. But maybe we should be surprised about how little the violence is in Scripture. It seems like a lot, but let's also remember we're just getting certain pieces of history. We're not getting a lot of the in-between, but even that is pretty violent. But the Bible isn't there to, again, deal with the violence per se, but it does place limits on violence, especially once we get to the Law of Moses, and very much especially when we get to the New Testament. It places limits there. It's about restraint. Scripture is about restraint, accountability, justice, where brutality is the normal sort of state of the world. War really is the normal state of the world. Moral boundaries matter to God. And so we need to realize that that's what's going on. So again, just because it's being recorded there doesn't mean it's something that God is condoning, although God certainly is involved in a fair amount of it. And I think maybe this is the part that we struggle with the most. We're used to violence, at least on a in terms of movies and television shows and things we read. And we're Americans, we're used to violence sort of happening other places. But I think it's this category of judgment and God's judgment on things that really modern readers really struggle with. It's not the human violence part of it. It's the divine judgment part of it. And judgment in Scripture is important. But let's remember that judgment in Scripture is not random cruelty. It's not God just acting willy-nilly how he wants. It's moral accountability. It's God making the claim that he is God and people are doing wrong and corrective measures need to be taken. So when we see this violence, especially from God or from God's people, he commands it of his people in Israel, for example, that this is God taking care of an evil that he has allowed to go on for a certain period of time, but it will not go unanswered forever. All right. Now, that doesn't make these passages easy to read. They're difficult, but it reframes what's happening. Again, it's God's judgment. It's moral judgment. It is done with a particular purpose in mind. What to us may seem like chaos or capriciousness is not. It's consequence. It's consequence for what people have done, for what cultures and societies have done. And so probably where this comes up the most is the most difficult for us to read about is in the conquest of Canaan. And there's a lot of passages that especially unsettle readers in this period of time where Israel is conquering Canaan. So when Israel enters the land, uh, it sounds severe. There's a lot going on. It's important to understand how the text frames these events. So first of all, these events are presented as unique events. They're not something that was supposed to happen forever. They are tied to a very specific period of time in Israel's history. They're not commands that Israel or anyone else, any other group or person is supposed to carry out for the duration of history. Secondly, we need to remember these are acts of judgment. This is not random stuff that's happening. The cultures that were in Canaan when Israel was coming to enter the land, again, God promised Abraham and others that they would inherit this land. And when God brought them in to do that, there were already a number of different peoples there. These peoples we will just call the Canaanite culture, but there were several others around. They are shown and portrayed as people who are deeply corrupt and very violent themselves. Now, that's the framing that's in Scripture, whether we agree with it or not. That's how the text presents the situation for us. And so we need to realize also that the language reflects the style of ancient Near Eastern war rhetoric that doesn't erase the severity. It's awful. The descriptions sound like they do because of the time they were written in, because of the time that all this was recorded. And within those narratives, even there, it's not super explicit, right? And we see restraint and mercy. Entire cultures are destroyed, but individuals are spared. Outsiders are incorporated. You know, the story really isn't about the conquest. That's the beginning of the story. And again, it's God's judgment on those people. The story moves past that pretty quickly, and it moves toward covenant and calling and God taking care of his people. So these passages are difficult. They're meant to be taken very seriously. They're meant to be a warning. They're meant to be something that we look at and say, oh, this is the kind of thing that happens when we disobey God. And so they're important. We shouldn't just skip over them. We shouldn't just hide them. But they're presented in a purposeful and I think limited way. There's probably much more that could have been said. Again, not as a general model for violence. This is not how we're supposed to act. We also need to realize that the Bible doesn't sanitize evil. Another reason that the Bible can feel violence is because it doesn't really soften the reality of the things that are going on and of the consequences. It names evil plainly. It calls it out. It shows consequences honestly. It doesn't romanticize things like war, which many modern people have done. War is terrible. War is awful. War is bad. It is not something that we want to engage in. And yet there were times when, for various reasons, people had to engage in war. That has happened in our own lifetimes. But it doesn't disguise corruption either. So sometimes what we maybe feel like is violent, what seems violent, is really just Scripture refusing to pretend that sin is mild, that human sin is easy, that it is okay. And so this can be unsettling. This kind of stark truth and stark contrast can be unsettling, but it is the truth. And then again, let's not forget that the story moves toward mercy. The Bible's not a static thing, although the Old Testament was written over 2,500 years ago and older. It's still a story that's moving somewhere. It itself, the Old Testament itself, was moving somewhere over those 1,000 years that it was written, 1,500 years that it was written. And then it continued to move forward in the first century as the Lord came. So it's a story going somewhere, and that somewhere isn't toward more violence. It is toward restraint, okay? It is toward mercy. It is toward redemption. It is toward Christ. The cross itself, of course, is extremely violent. And many of you have probably seen a movie like The Passion of the Christ, which for as much reality as it tried to portray, I'm persuaded the reality of the crucifixion was far worse than what we saw in film. And so the cross itself was violent, but it was violence that Jesus absorbed, not violence that Jesus and God inflicted. It's the final sort of vision of Scripture that there will not be endless war. There will be, in fact, restoration. There's all these prophecies about turning our, swords to plowshares and everyone getting along and these kinds of things. It's a back to Eden kind of experience. Heaven, all of this. It's restoration. It's a trajectory that moves forward. So we need to remember that when we're especially now we're doing our Bible readings. If you're following with our schedule, and we just finished Judges and Joshua. Now Samuel is coming up, and then we're going to be in Kings and all this. There's a lot of violence. There's a tremendous amount of violence. There's a lot of war. And we need to remember that God is taking all this seriously. God takes evil seriously. It's not a joke. It represents judgments as being real things that impact real people. And it just doesn't sanitize human sin. It tells us a story of God who intends not merely to judge us, but to redeem us. And so there are parts of Scripture that are unsettling, that are difficult, and that's okay. It's supposed to be. It doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you have a lack of understanding. It means you're paying attention to what's going on, and it should bother you. That's part of the point of the Old Testament when we read it as modern people, as Christians. It should bother us, all of that. But remember, this is God's judgment, at least most of it. There are plenty of others who were violent, and their violence was recorded, and of course there would be consequences to that. So, the hard passages aren't the end of the story. They're part of a bigger picture that we need to remember, again, that moves toward, and wants to go ultimately toward this justice, mercy, and restoration. And I don't know about you, but that's a story that I really want to see the end of. I want to experience the end of. Well, thanks for watching. This is a little bit about why Scripture, especially the Old Testament, seems so violent. Again, if you like our content, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. Ask questions in the links down below. Put your comments down there. We'll answer them. We might even make videos out of the comments and questions that you have. In any case, have a good one.